My name is Robert Myers. I think I know almost everyone here, because I feel strange introducing myself. I'm the current director of CASAR. I'd like to just tell you about a couple of upcoming events as the semester winds down. One is tomorrow. We're going to show the Academy Award-winning documentary Inside Job, which, if you have not seen it, I highly recommend it. It's tomorrow at the Mamre Auditorium at the Olayan Business School, and it is co-sponsored with the Business School and with the Institute for Financial Economics. And afterwards, there'll be a brief discussion with Marcus Mark-Tanner from the Institute of Financial Economics and Steve McNamara from the Business School. Not too long, but both have very interesting takes on the film, and it's a very important film about the economic crisis of 2008. As I said, it won an Academy Award. So that's tomorrow at 5:30. On May the 3rd, Margaret Littman, who's a friend of mine who writes about Arab theater and will be here for the Shakespeare in the Orient concert. The conference that Francois Gleason in English is putting together. We're taking advantage of that, and she will be giving a talk on Arab theater. She's translated a number of works and written extensively about Arab theater and culture, and is particularly interested in Russian influence in Arab culture. On the 9th, we have the Beirut Dearborn connection with Bill DeGenero, who's the Fulbright Scholar from the English department, with Margaret Willard Traub, who's his partner, who works in Dearborn, and they work on issues related to English among the Lebanese there and here. So, and Bill's been a huge asset to the English department. It should be very interesting what he's learned during his year here. Then the final couple of events. One is May the 12th. The banjo virtuoso Michael Miles from Chicago will be here to give a CASAR talk in which he'll have some spoken word, poetry, play a little banjo. It's an event that will be co-sponsored by Canes, the Fine Arts Department, and in conjunction with Wellspring School out by the museum. On the 17th, he'll be giving a concert with several local musicians, a qanun player, a pipa player, drum, someone who plays the drums. We do have to charge a small admission of $15,000, but it would be wonderful if you can support the event. He's quite an extraordinary musician. And then finally, but we're ending the semester with a friend of Joshua Andreessen's. His name is William Nolan from the University of Alabama, who will be talking about how Jaws changed the world, or something like that, or how it's an important rupture in American culture. This evening gives me enormous pleasure to introduce a good friend and a great scholar, Dr. Robert Reid-Pharr. He's currently the Edward Said Chair of American Studies here at CASAR. Before that, he was a distinguished and presidential professor of English and American Studies at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Robert Reid-Pharr holds a Ph.D. in American Studies from Yale. Before coming to the Graduate Center at CUNY, he was an assistant and associate professor of English at the Johns Hopkins University. In addition, he has been the Drue Heinz visiting professor of English at the University of Oxford, the Carlisle and Barbara Moore distinguished visiting professor of English at the University of Oregon, the Frederic Ives Carpenter visiting assistant professor of English at the University of Chicago. He's a specialist in African American culture and a prominent scholar in the field of race and sexuality studies. He's published 3 books and numerous articles, and among other places, American literature, American literary history, Callaloo, Afterimage, Small Acts, the Chronicle of Higher Education, etc. His research and writing have been supported by grants from the Ford Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. So it gives me, as I said, enormous pleasure to introduce to you Robert Reid-Pharr, who will speak on Langston Hughes' Spanish Adventure. Robert.
Thank you. Well, I just want to say, because I don't think that I'm going to have another opportunity to say it, to thank you to all of you, that my time at AUB and in Beirut and in Lebanon has been really remarkable. Frankly, I'm not certain why the Lebanese Board of Tourism has not contacted me to make one of those goofy "I love Lebanon" commercials for the country, because in fact I love Lebanon, and I really have been taken by how unbelievably gracious everyone has been to me, and I particularly have been taken by how gracious everyone in this room has been to me. It means a lot to me. So I hope that you all feel appreciated and flattered, and maybe even a little bit flirted with. Those of you who were here last year when I actually gave the talk that led to my being appointed the Edward Said Chair know that I'm writing a book on Afro-Americans in Spain. And so this is a chapter from that book. I won't do much of a setup because the talk takes the better part of an hour. So I want to get on with it so that we can have some time for question and answer. The one thing I will say is that I'll change the name a little bit to Langston's Adventures in the Dark. I've written all of it actually I should thank Mahmoud Saleh, because I've stolen his office, which is a nice, large, big office in which to write. And it's been wonderful. It starts with 2 epigrams. I'm here to remind you that the Negro's position as outcast is his most powerful human driving force, a force which hurls him forward towards a wider horizon that is more universal, more just, towards a horizon for which all honorable men are struggling today. Nicolas Guillet. Nobody loves a genius child. Can you love an eagle, tame or wild, wild or tame? Can you love a monster, a frightening name? Nobody loves a genius child. Kill him and let his soul run wild. Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was an exception. Although the lion's share of the criticism surrounding our so-called Negro poet laureate, including much of that written by Hughes himself, demonstrates a hunger to read him as the apotheosis of a profoundly ancient and decidedly fixed tradition of black folk culture, Hughes represented something new. His work registered a break with the habits and conventions of the multi-hued peoples of Africa, Europe, and America. His poetry and prose assault the unchallenged tranquility with which we too often approach questions of history and tradition. Thus, this personage on whom so much reverence and debate have been expended has elicited a stunning amount of what one might call critical vertigo among the generations of admirers and detractors who have taken up his peculiar case. Was he a socialist? Maybe. Modernist? Perhaps. Homosexual? Who can say? At every turn, however, our criticism seems studiously to avoid what I take to be Hughes's obvious truth. His genius was built on the refusal of the assumptions that underwrite received notions of what comprises black American intellectualism. Moreover, he resisted, sometimes more, other times less, the equally pernicious notion that experimentation and anti-traditionalism necessarily entail the rejection of presumably old-fashioned commitments to social justice. One might, that is, avoid the tendency to overvalue vernacular culture, the stifling insistment that Albert Memmi bemoans, without wholly turning one's copper-colored face in the direction of the withering light of Euro-American forms of capitalism and colonization. The problem, however, is that the third alternative, the third path that many have valiantly, if quixotically attempted, is so difficult to discern because it exists only and ever as a half-formed improvisational idea, an entity given substance through equal measures of experimentation and daring. The genius, the author of new forms of thought and action, must attempt to execute his belief, his somewhat inchoate reverence for the possibilities of possibilities, the possibility of possibilities, in the absence of any certainty that his actions will prove successful. He must court danger even to the extent of threatening bread and board, disrupting the comforts of his own home and those of his neighbors as well. One begins to gain some sympathy then for the tendency of our various cultures, popular and otherwise, to extol the many virtues of so-called radicals while nonetheless censuring, detaining, and eliminating individuals who drift too far outside the precincts of established norms. Wild or tame, the truly exceptional individual is at once celebrated and hounded. In the case of Hughes, one is reminded of the poverty with which he had to contend throughout much of his life, as well as the fact that he continually was forced to confront and deny claims that he was communist and anti-Christian. Moreover, the enduring debates over his legacy are quite often motivated, I would argue, by an only half-acknowledged desire to domesticate him, to tie him once and for all to simplistic narratives of black, gay, folk, or socialist tradition. As with Federico Garcia Lorca, our struggles to celebrate Hughes, to consume him, are themselves built upon a denial or deadening of those many parts of his biography and oeuvre that resist easy definition. What we wish for when we invoke the name Hughes is a well-packaged, easily digestible commodity. He was first and foremost, we are assured, a great popularizer of beloved American folk forms, particularly Negro blues and jazz, one who attempted as well as he could to insulate himself from both American conservatism and the effete formality of modernism. Might turn then to what I name Hughes's dark adventures, especially his engagements with Cuba, Mexico, Spain, and the Spanish language, is done in part to register my skepticism about both Hughes's timidity, as well as to name and resist the rigidity and calcification that I believe exists within the practice of comparativist, multicultural, and transnational criticism. I want to examine Hughes alongside Spaniards and the Hispanic, not simply to reiterate the self-congratulatory assumption that we are able to speak with them, but also to unsettle any sense of certainty or propriety among those of us invested in what one might call the New Atlantic Studies. Indeed, the work of this chapter is to demonstrate that the confidence that too often attends our cultural studies is not only a manufactured but also a vigorously guarded product, something for and about which one might rightfully fight. Thus, in naming the ethics, or if you prefer, the metaphysics of my thinking, I would state simply that the truth, the promise of Atlantic subjectivity, was established not by capitalists in New York, London, or Madrid, nor by their cultured compatriots and apologists in the sheltered enclaves of Cambridge, Oxford, or Salamanca. Instead, I persistently hold to the belief that the much more realistic and valuable conception of Atlantic modernity was established both by the multi-ethnic, multilingual crews, the mariners, renegades, and castaways of the ships that attempted the Middle Passage, as well as their living cargo, the many African peoples pressed together below deck in the stink and the dark of the Brooks and the Amistad, the Polly and the Jesus. Building upon the work of Paul Gilroy, among others, I assert that ships, especially slave ships, are particularly useful models of modernity, living microcosms of modern life. Most specifically, I argue that ships were key nodal points in the development of Atlantic aesthetic practices. In this sense, I see my work as an extension of the complex procedures of intercultural contact and contamination that necessarily took and take place aboard ships, contact and contamination accomplished most commonly and often most effectively in the dark. It is therefore imperative that we remain cognizant of the fact that sailing is at once a scientific and a cultural or artistic operation. To be sure, both above and below deck, Africans and Europeans had, as a matter of life and death, to remain ever cognizant of how much they did not know, that is to say, how much they had to imagine. I would ask, therefore, that my work be read not only as anti-essentialist, but radically so. When I use the word tradition, I mean to invoke neither kingdoms nor cultures. Alternatively, I work to discern some of the only half-illuminated ways that enslaved and colonized peoples have utilized the often contradictory structures of the discursive in order to access the interstitial, unknown, awkwardly policed, and dark precincts of modernity, of modern culture and society. You will hopefully understand then why I place so much value on the belief that that which cannot be properly registered, the dark and often occult pidgin, Creole, unlettered, and unmoored cultures that were quickly established and just as quickly discarded in ports, aboard ships, in auction houses, and on plantations, might be understood not simply as the detritus of modernity, the refuse that has no value, but instead as a source for the undoing, the unbecoming of the modern structures and strictures that have proven so enervating to so many. Thus, my efforts are neither certain nor therapeutic. These gummy, clumsy sentences are best improvisational. We do not know where we are going. We have no clear idea of what lies ahead. In the face of that reality, the focal point of all Black intellectuals, all Atlantic intellectuals, all intellectuals, including Hughes, dispersed as we are in the void of diaspora, must ever remain on the possibilities inherent in divination, interpretation, translation, misunderstanding, and misprision. Again, invoking Mimi, I ask, quote, "Is it certain that this language which stammers today is unable to develop and become rich?" End quote. And more important still, does an eloquence established by capriciousness and bloodlust not grate on the ear? In the summer of 1923, a 21-year-old Langston Hughes arrived off the west coast of Africa as part of the multinational crew of the SS Mellon. He soon found himself at Secondi, the Gold Coast port town established by the Dutch in 1640 in order to service the ships that carried cloth, jewelry, cooking pots, and guns to the Ashanti. They then reversed directions bearing precious minerals, timber, and slaves to Europe and the Americas. Bored and rambunctious, Hughes and his shipmates found that Secondi continued its traffic in gold, rubber, and timber, even as it had stopped the exportation of slaves. This did not mean, however, that the town had fully given up its traffic in human flesh. Hughes describes a brisk business in prostitution, the majority of whose practitioners were quite young, quite small, sometimes prepubescent girls with bushy hair and hennaed nails, to whom hungry sailors were directed by African boys claiming that the girls were their sisters, boys who patiently waited for their clients outside the girls' huts or slept on floor mats beside the coupling pair if the seaman had the inclination and the money to spend the night. Though at least two generations of critics, including both J. Saunders Redding and Arnold Rampersad, claim that Hughes is surprisingly guarded in his two autobiographies, I would counter that his description of the young prostitutes of Secondi is relentless. In front of one hut, 3 white sailors from a British ship were bargaining with an old woman, he writes. Behind her, frightened and ashamed, stood a small girl said to be a virgin. The price was £4. The sailors argued for a cheaper rate. They hadn't that much money. You will forgive me for pointing out that the logic of the British sailors was impeccable. The value of small African girls in what we euphemistically call the open market has never been high. And perhaps more to the point, there continues to be some confusion about what is actually being bought and sold. Even Hughes seems to wonder about the claim of the girl's virginity. Indeed, within the racialist logics that underwrite so much within modern culture and thought, to place the words black and virgin against one another would seem at best oxymoronic, at worst ridiculous. What most titillates, however, what piques the interest of Hughes's readers is the suggestion that something much more valuable, more discreet than sex was being sold at Secondi, something that ultimately could not be either properly measured or named. Hughes tells us that during the night, as the ship remained anchored off the coast, 2 girls, petite ladies of the evening, rowed a small boat out to the Mellon. One of them was taken by the boatswain to his private cabin. The other was left in the quarters of the crew to quench the desire, the modern wanting that continues to be so very difficult either to acknowledge or articulate. Quote, "She lay there naked and held up her hands. The girl said, 'Moaning,' but nobody had any money. 30 men crowded around, mostly in their underwear, sat up on bunks, watched, smoked, yelled, and joked, and waited for their turn. Each time a man would rise, the little African girl on the floor would say, 'Moaning, moaning,' but nobody had a cent. Yet they wouldn't let her get up. Finally, I couldn't bear to hear her crying 'moaning' anymore, so I went to bed. But the festival went on all night." What I want to resist in my reading of this passage is reiteration of wholly still critical procedures. Yes, Hughes describes the sexual abuse, the rape of a child. Yes, that abuse is both facilitated by misogyny and white supremacy. Yes, the scene is not only homosocial, but decidedly homoerotic. The tension and the thrill of the moment maintained not only by the displayed nakedness of the girl, but also by the sailors themselves, their underwear, anticipation, and sweat working together to achieve the tumescence of transnational passion. Still, as I've stated repeatedly, I'm unconcerned in these pages with established fact, the so-called known world. Instead, I would suggest that we read the sailors' actions, and the girls for that matter, as a sort of vulgar, if profoundly effective, critical practice. Though Hughes never bothers to say so, it is obvious that what haunts this scene is the specter of the middle passage. The multiracial crew, the naked African girl, were lost together atop the aloofness and profundity of the Atlantic. Their revelry a type of theater, a ritualized evocation of a never quite palpable certainty. Like the believer who calms his fretfulness through the wearing of crosses or the fingering of beads, what the crew attacks is both much more and much less than a dark-skinned African girl hungry for money. Instead, what they attempt to defeat is the sense of possibility that she represents, that spectacular and elusive virginity that might leave both men and cultures forever adrift. They press her down, moor and anchor her, just as their predecessors carved their vows into images of half-naked women, wooden breasts providing proof of a life, a culture, a past greater than the ocean's unnamed mystery. That images of prostitutes recur so frequently in The Big Sea and Hughes's autobiographies, The Big Sea and I Wonder as I Wander, and indeed throughout all of Hughes's work, suggest how important, yet how poorly understood he considered this benighted figure to be within narratives of Atlantic modernity. Much like Picasso, he recognized the prostitute as standing not at the periphery of modern society, but at its dead, dark center, the very personification of the complex interplay between bright fantasies of solidly established tradition and the dark, sullen acceptance of human ignorance. I would continue this line of thinking by rejecting out of hand the far too facile tendency to pity, belittle, and castigate such individuals. In actual fact, the policing of so-called profligate, abnormal sexual exchange has as much to do with the denial of the most vulgar aspects of exploitation as with any real concern to name and relieve human misery. One must wonder why the image of a dark-skinned girl selling sex on the west coast of Africa can arouse so much indignity, while the colonialist and capitalist structures that enable such practices are either ignored or worse yet celebrated. Again, I remain resistant and allergic to notions of the established, the respectable, and the normative. I call for a specifically politicized Black Atlantic cultural studies, specific in that it reiterates and develops those modes of articulation that recognize capitalism and colonization for what they are, the vulgar attempt to turn human beings into coin. Moreover, as I've said, I am most concerned with how we might build upon the veiled methods, the so-called weapons of the weak, utilized by Africans and their descendants to resist white supremacy and capitalist exploitation. Where this work is unapologetically African-American is in its acknowledgement and celebration of the reality that black politics and culture are full of half measures, indecisive victories, local advances. We are an uncanny people, conquered yet undefeated, thriving in the midst of relentless attack. My method then is to turn to those many places in black, American, and Atlantic cultural life where the everyday forms of assault and resistance to assault are both remarked and obscured. As a correspondent during the Spanish Civil War, Hughes tells of the mandatory blackouts in Madrid as fascist rebels, greatly aided by the Germans and Italians, bombed the city using any visible light to direct their shells. Undeterred, the Madrileña prostitutes, their houses deprived of electricity, would take to the streets around the Puerta del Sol, particularly the block behind Madrid's only skyscraper, the Telefónica. There in the dark, they plied their trade to hundreds of waiting soldiers, many of them members of the international brigades that had come to defend the liberty, if not always the chastity, of Republican Spain. Quote, "The darkness up and down the street would be pinpointed by the tiny flames of dozens and dozens of matches being lighted by soldiers to peer into the faces of the prostitutes walking in the dark. The blackout canyon of the street danced with little flames of hope, burning briefly, then flung to the ground as some young soldier, lighting a match at the sound of a seductive voice, would found himself peering into a broken-down witch's face." What I would point to here is not the rather open and untidy secret of the centuries-long and quite often officially sanctioned relationship between soldiers and prostitutes. Moreover, I hope that it is obvious that I am unlikely to blush when faced with the fact that sex is often the currency of international travel and tourism. I'm struck, however, by how careful Hughes is in his framing of the scene. The continual reference to light and dark, the tiny flames that inhabit but never fill the blackout canyon, even the occasional explosion of an artillery shell, giving, quote, a sudden burst of light, enough for a soldier to see a woman clearly and perhaps pick out a partner for his needs, end quote, reiterates the desperate yet barely acknowledged struggle of modern subjects with the most basic, most obvious truths of history and humanity. The war in Spain represented at its core the ongoing struggle between so-called modernists, including anarchists, communists, and a motley collection of artists and intellectuals, and those who celebrated the tradition and certainty that was personified by the royal family, the landed elite, and the military. Moreover, that the traffic in prostitutes took place both near the Puerta del Sol, the Sun Gate, and behind the Telefónica, emblem of Spain's willingness to communicate across geographic, cultural, and national boundaries, should alert even the sleepiest of Hughes's readers to the fact that the battle for Madrid was but a continuation of the struggle between those of us who continued to claim to know the fixed truth and those of us who continued and continue to hedge our bets. If I might be allowed to venture so far as to announce the tragedy of this scene, I would suggest that what defeats the promise of shared humanity is in fact the light. The bombs and matches hide much more than they reveal. They turn the simplest of our sins and pleasures, the animal coupling of women with men, toward an ideological complexity that has proven repeatedly to be deadly, more than capable of extinguishing both light and dark. Marx warns us that, quote, "The social revolution cannot draw its poetry from the past, but only from the future. It cannot begin with itself before it has stripped itself of all of its superstitions concerning the past," end quote. I would add here that one of the more profoundly enervating of these superstitions is our irrational fear of the dark, a fear established, I would argue, on the assumption of both unknown dangers and pleasures. Hughes punctuates the previous passage by telling us that the young women of Madrid breathlessly gave themselves to their lovers in anticipation of the city's imminent defeat by Franco's forces, only to be counted as whores when the promised fall did not come. He also relates the rumor that the rebels' shock troops, dark North African Muslims, Moors, who stand so solidly in the Spanish national imagination, had been promised their pick of the Castilian women should the city fall. Imagine, said the Madrileños, that rebel Franco bringing Mohammedans to Spain to fight Christians. The Crusaders would turn over in their graves. In both cases, what seems obvious is that it is quite difficult, perhaps impossible, to separate disgust from desire. Should an off-white hand reach toward the raven-haired beauty of his beloved, he would find himself touching the very embodiment of delinquency and defeat. And even more importantly, had the benighted Spaniards, radicals, liberals, and conservatives alike, allowed themselves to relinquish hold on their desperate fantasies of European belonging, that ever-elusive promise of whiteness, in order to reconcile with the African, the Mohammedan, the dark, Spain might have been spared the killing, the poverty, the shame, and retribution that continue to grip both it and the continent to which it so tenuously clings. Come now, all you who are singers, and sing me the Song of Spain. Sing it simply that I might understand. What is the Song of Spain? Flamenco is the Song of Spain. Gypsies, guitars, dancing, death and love and heartbreak to a heel tap and a swirl of fingers on 3 strings. Flamenco is the Song of Spain. I do not understand. Toros are the Song of Spain. The bellowing bull, the red cape, a sword thrust, a horn tip, the torn suit of satin and gold, blood on the sand is the Song of Spain. I do not understand. Pintura is the Song of Spain. Goya, Velázquez, Murillo, splash of color on canvas, whirl of cherub faces. La Maja Desnuda is the Song of Spain. What's that? Don Quixote, España, aquel rincón de la Mancha de cuyo nombre no quiero acordarme. That's the Song of Spain. You wouldn't kid me, would you? A bombing plane's the Song of Spain, bullets like rain, the Song of Spain, poison gas is Spain, a knife in the back and its terror and pain in Spain, toros, flamencos, paintings, books, not Spain. The people are Spain. The people beneath that bombing plane with its wings of gold for which I pay. I, a worker letting my labor pile up millions for bombs to kill a child. I bought those bombs for Spain. Workers made those bombs for a fascist Spain. Will I make them again and yet again? There is something troubling about this poem, something undecided. Hughes rehearses many of the most precious images of Spain and the Spanish people: flamenco, gypsies, guitars, the bellowing bull, the red cape, Goya, Velázquez, Murillo, Don Quixote are all represented. Yet the very breathlessness of Hughes's verse belies the idea of a clearly discernible Song of Spain. The antiphonic pacing, the give and take between the ever-persistent questioner and his increasingly hesitant interlocutor leads one to imagine a certain skepticism regarding Spain's reality. What's that? I don't understand. There is what one might call a critical flat-footedness on display in the poem, an inability to register the piece's romantic imagery. Finally, we are left with the certainty that the officially sanctioned markers of Spanish culture, toros, flamenco, paintings, books, are in fact not Spain. Instead, Hughes turns toward the people, resolving the ideological conflict that I take the poem to represent in favor of the lived reality of modern individuals. Moreover, if you have followed my arguments thus far, you will understand that those bombs bursting above Spanish heads are themselves part of a desperate attempt to disrupt and delay the inevitable dispersal and rejection of even and especially the most cherished aspects of so-called traditional culture. Thus, fascism is never more apparent or lovely than at the moment at which it rains down on coarse, decadent humanity, bringing misery and death in explosions of brilliant light. It is telling that as with the prostitute whose witch-like face is hidden in the darkness, Hughes returns repeatedly to the image of bombs bursting overhead in his attempt to examine the discursive and ideological structures that gird both modern forms of exploitation and the never fully articulate resistance to that exploitation. Bombing imagery appears in Air Raid, Barcelona, Moonlight in Valencia, Civil War, Madrid, Shall the Good Go Down, and Stalingrad, 1942. More interesting still, Hughes's use of the trope is not restricted to those several poems that treat conflicts in Spain and Europe more generally. In August 19th, a poem for Clarence Norris, an elegy for one of the black teenagers convicted of rape and sentenced to be electrocuted in the infamous Scottsboro case, Hughes describes the dreadfulness of the exploding bomb in order to relate the horrific miscarriages of justice that Norris and many other black Americans suffered to the global oppression of working and poor people. Stop all the leeches that use their power to strangle hope, that make of the law a lyncher's rope, that drop their bombs on China and Spain, that have no pity for hunger or pain. What chills, however, what causes Hughes's readers to wince and gulp, is the fact that he was even so bold as to imagine the bombing of Harlem, the very epicenter of black American cultural and intellectual life. He provocatively titles one of the most radically iconoclastic of his poems, Air Raid over Harlem, scenario for a little black movie, suggesting that the literal maiming, dismemberment, and killing of human beings is intimately related to the forms of anesthetizing spectacles, beguiling plays of light within dark, by which Americans, and much of the rest of the world for that matter, continue to be so enamored. Planes over Harlem, bombs over Harlem. You're making up a fake funny picture, ain't you? Not real, not real. Did you ever taste blood from an iron heel planted in your mouth in the slavery time South, where to whip a nigger's easy as hell, and even a living nigger has a tail to tell, lest the kick of a boot bearing more blood to his mouth in the slavery time South, and a long billy club split his head wide, and a white hand draw a gun from its side, and send bullets flying through the streets of Harlem, where the dead are laying, lest you stir in your sleep, and remember something you best better keep in the dark, where the ugly things are, under the white lights, with guns by their sides, in Harlem. What Hughes alerts his readers to here is that even, and especially, the presumably most progressive of our cultural, social, and historical studies remain deeply, even smugly segregated. Bombs over Harlem, fake funny pictures, the slavery time South, are easily related to the bombs over Madrid, Valencia, and Barcelona. This is an obvious fact. In truth, what stuns is that the relatively new assumption of innate and profound difference between the peoples and nations of the so-called Atlantic world has become so unquestioned and unchallenged that those who attempt to address this problem often find it difficult to be understood. Their words are heard as lisps and stutters, things to be pitied and corrected, evidence of cultural and intellectual lack. Following Hughes, one imagines that the first and still most potent word established within the Atlantic vocabulary was mo-ni, that our cultural practices have been produced between the very teeth of capitalist oppression. It seems to me that the time has come for us to stretch the central conceits of African American studies to their very limits. It is true that my enslaved ancestors formed new modes of relation and belief from out of the detritus of their lost traditions. What remains largely unspoken, however, is the simple fact that modern forms of European, or if you prefer white, culture were also established by the history of contact, conquest, colonization, and travel, to which we attach many names, most notoriously the Middle Passage. Turning to the claim by Mexican Americans that the true founder of Mexican culture was La Malinche, or La Chingada, literally the fucked one, the woman who was both Cortez's translator and mistress, his prostitute if you prefer. I would suggest to you that this dark, difficult woman was not simply the mother of the colonized or the oppressed, but instead of everything, or at least everything worth maintaining within Atlantic culture and society. The structures underwriting prostitution in Secondi and Madrid, bombing over Valencia and Harlem, are indistinguishable one from the other. I began this chapter by discussing the multi-ethnic and often multiracial crews who were responsible for transporting captured Africans to the so-called New World. I continue here by reiterating the claims of scholars of the Atlantic slave trade, including Marcus Rediker and Stephanie Smallwood, that slave ships were in no way culturally or ideologically inert. Striking, however, what bewilders anyone with at least anyone with a modicum of humility, who has seen blue-skinned women with children strapped to their backs in the Spanish city of Las Palmas, or enjoyed the view of the Italian coastline from the Tunisian island of Jerba, is the profundity of both violence and sophistry that has been and continues to be deployed in order to maintain the distinction between the European and the African, the light white, and the dark black. Again, if the history of the Atlantic slave trade has demonstrated anything, however, it must surely be that the boundaries between languages, cultures, ethnicities, religions, nationalities, and races are entirely porous. Here is where I would defend my contention that Hughes is not only a modern, but also a modernist writer. In doing so, I want to resist the assumption that modernism represents only and ever the culmination of a set of European and American aesthetic practices, most forcefully demonstrated by the work of masters such as T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. Instead, I maintain simply that modernist artists and intellectuals struggled in their works either to accept or disavow inherent contradictions embedded in the ideological structures of modernity. While I celebrate the struggles of Albert Vuitton, Pablo Picasso, Gertrude Stein, and many others against the rigidity of traditional aesthetic forms, particularly realism, I nonetheless lack the ability, the eloquence one might say, to separate their efforts from the violence that has typified modern life. In the case of the United States, I would gesture toward not only slavery and the slave trade, but also the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 that culminated in the American annexation of nearly one-third of Mexico, the U.S. Civil War of 1860 to 1865, in which the country ripped itself apart, then found the darkly shining faces of free men and women giving the lie to the fantasy of the country's white European roots. The Spanish-American War of 1898 that brought the colored island of Puerto Rico into the national fold while keeping nominally independent Cuba close at hand. And finally, the First World War, in which Europeans proved conclusively that centuries of grand civilization notwithstanding, they were most certainly not above the indiscriminate use of bombs, bullets, and bayonets. In the face of all this, it is easy to see how it might be difficult to continue the elegant arc of brush on canvas or the self-assured linearity of words on the page. My continued criticism, however, my charge against friends and adversaries alike, is that the horrific disruptions represented by these wars were hardly new. It bears repeating that no matter how often one utters the white lie of the U.S.-European civilizing mission, slavery and colonization are nothing short of well-managed martial incursions against oppressed and exploited peoples. Moreover, that modernism continues to be narrated, even by so-called progressives, as essentially the cultural and aesthetic reaction of Europeans, their descendants, and their lookalikes to breaks with traditions that began in Paris, Berlin, Vienna, London, and Barcelona, seems nothing more than the rearticulation of Euro-American ideologies of innate ethnic and racial distinction. Or to reiterate the primary argument of this chapter, part of what ails the practice of Atlantic cultural studies is our continued inability to recognize the obvious fact that not only enchained Africans, but also their so-called white masters, and indeed much of the world, would have to find new forms of articulation, new vocabularies with which to address the shock, the rupture, the profound violence of slavery and colonization. Where I believe we often misread Hughes, therefore, is in the assumption that his efforts to celebrate and articulate black folk culture represented a retreat from the complexity of modernity. His concern for the mumbling, rasping, too loud, and metonymic tendencies within the Black American use of the English language has been understood far too often, I would suggest, as an attempt to defend the dignity of a people who stand aloof from modernity. Moreover, his travels and his use of so-called foreign languages, French, Spanish, Russian, have been read as largely anthropological in nature. Even his translations, most notably of Jacques Roman, Nicolas Guillen, Gabriela Mistral, and most especially Federico Garcia Lorca, are imagined to be part of his ongoing efforts to retrieve and protect those parts of Spanish and Latin American culture that were in danger of being eclipsed by an all-consuming modernity. This is though Roman, Guillen, Mistral, and Lorca were themselves all deeply concerned with how the creative intellectual might name and negotiate the complex interplay between tradition and innovation. My contention then is that one of the primary modes by which white supremacist and colonialist projects are maintained is through a sort of insistent sophistry and clumsiness in relation to matters of culture. We continue to be far too prepared to accept the assumption that our aesthetic procedures develop along well-established, discrete paths that bear no relation to politics and economics. Hughes himself noted these facts when he related the details of his rupture with his erstwhile patron, Charlotte Osgood Mason. Mason, like many of her generation, was self-conscious about what she took to be the excesses of modern society, excesses that presumably worked to produce a certain spiritual and cultural ruthlessness among contemporary Americans and Europeans. She decided, therefore, to commit her considerable wealth to supporting and developing primitive and aboriginal art forms, chiefly those produced by Plains Indians and Black Americans, including a number of the most famous personnel of the so-called Harlem Renaissance, especially Hughes, Zora Hurston, and Elaine Locke. She wanted me to be a primitive and to know and feel the intuitions of the primitive, Hughes writes. But unfortunately, I did not feel the rhythms of the primitive surging through me, and so I could not live and write as though I did. I was only an American Negro who had loved the surface of Africa and the rhythms of Africa, but I was not Africa. I was Chicago and Kansas City and Broadway and Harlem, and I was not what she wanted me to be. So in the end, it all came back very near to the old impasse of white and Negro, again, white and Negro, as do most relationships in America. At the risk of overreaching myself, I will argue that the structure of the relationship that Mason wanted from Hughes was exactly the structure of the relationships that British and American sailors wanted with adolescent prostitutes on the coast of West Africa. What Mason desired, like many before and after her, was that the African American creative intellectual deny that his creations were in fact produced through work, not inspiration, not soul, not some bestial essence, but actual work. Thus, one of the reasons I've been so concerned in this chapter to make plain the laboring of prostitutes is that much of the drudgery of the prostitute's trade is that, as with captive Africans forced to dance and sing aboard ships, she must toil without ever seeming to do so. The same can be said of all manner of African American laborers. As Fanon reminds us, the colonizer desires that the slave be full of enthusiasm, never remarking in his or her comportment awareness of any exploitation. Thus, the rejection by Mason was to prove a decisive moment in Hughes' development as an intellectual. It was then that he was forced to acknowledge the true relationship of art and culture to society. He was compelled to act upon the belief that art not to represent an escape from the realities of class and race exploitation, but on the contrary, an attempt to make plain the discursive and ideological contradictions that this exploitation produces. If my own reading of Hughes has been celebratory or hagiographic, it is because I'm intrigued by the many ways in which Hughes risked and perhaps courted the mistrust of readers and patrons alike. Or to turn my comments back toward the main currents of the transracial, transnational journey that I invite you to imagine this chapter as, I would reiterate my contention that the cultural work that has sustained all of us has centered upon learning to communicate across so-called racial, ethnic, and linguistic difference. Of necessity, we have had to learn the syntax of glossolalia, the art of speaking in tongues. At the same time, however, I do not want my comments to be understood as simply a celebration of the ambiguous or the uncertain. Though I claim no particular allegiance to Africa, Europe, or America, I nonetheless boldly announce the ascendancy of those of us who have been outcast, displaced, shunned, and exiled. I claim, in fact, that Hughes's much heralded embrace of Hispanic culture was motivated not only by a sort of black wanderlust, but also a deeper, and in the logic of this chapter, darker acknowledgement of the necessity of breaking and syncopating the rhythms of modern life, a necessity that has been understood most clearly by those of us willing to relinquish the intoxicating comforts of national, ethnic, religious, and racial fetishism. In the days of the broken cubes of Picasso, and in the days of the broken songs of young men, a little too drunk to sing, and the young women, a little too unsure of love to love, I met on the boulevards of Paris an African from Senegal. God knows why the French amuse themselves bringing to Paris Negroes from Senegal. It's the old game of the boss and the boss, boss and the boss, amused and amusing, worked and working behind the cubes of black and white, black and white, black and white. But since it is the old game, for fun they've given him the 3 old prostitutes of France, liberty, equality, fraternity, and all 3 of them sick, in spite of the tax to the government, and the doctors, and the Marseillais. Of course, the young African from Senegal carries back from Paris a little more disease, to spread among the black girls in the palm huts, disease, from light to darkness, disease, from the boss to the boss, from the boss to the boss, disease, from the game of black and white, disease, from the city of broken cubes of Picasso, D-I-S-E-A-S-E. I will end by wondering out loud for a moment why the sophisticated and self-consciously modernistic poem of Hughes's, Cubes, has received so little attention by his many critics, biographers, and translators. Indeed, apart from Seth Moglen's excellent 2002 treatment of this work, there has been scant critical attention paid to it. This is though the text possesses many of the elements for which Hughes is rightfully famous: travel, concern for the poor and working classes, sensitivity to both Latin and African cultures, and most importantly for our efforts here, fascination with the play of light and dark. Moreover, Hughes deploys not only his signature free verse style, but also an extremely evocative graphic representation of movement between and across cultures. I would suggest, in fact, that the separation of the word disease into its composite parts, those 7 lucky letters, demonstrates an author not simply attempting to relate the dispersal of pestilence, but also, and importantly, to reach, however awkwardly, toward a new language, the pidgin and Creole that I spoke of earlier, a language that might help him to name what must have been infinitely apparent as he encountered his black African doppelganger on one of the lovely boulevards in the City of Light. What the two knew, but could not easily speak, was the old game of boss and boss, amused and amusing, worked and working. They looked into the manufactured faces of slavers and colonizers alike and found them lacking. For this crime, legions of women and men have fallen under gun and whip, knife and prod. Many others have found their most cherished labors reviled, or worse yet, ignored. It seems then that there were but few avenues open for this radical man of letters. He had to turn toward the vulgarities that one might utter in the dark, toward the whispered, muted forms of discourse that might allow a brown-skinned poet to recognize and plainly name even the most celebrated Western maidens, liberty, equality, fraternity, as little more than diseased prostitutes. This, however, was no easy gambit. For as is evident in Hughes itself, one of the most durable tenets of white supremacy is that the black, the aboriginal, the Arab, the Asian, the Jew is already the very marker of vulgarity, the sign of cultural and ideological infection. Worse yet, all too often, these agents of illness and disorder seem to lack even the good sense to keep quiet about these well-known, if not easily or properly spoken facts. As with Hughes, the most inelegant among them seem ever ready to proclaim in their clumsy, thick-lipped manner the most inconvenient of truths. Indeed, they continue to resist magnanimously proffered integration into the precincts of respectability, to lurk about the dusky edges, even as their erstwhile masters invite them to the play and the light. Nonetheless, I continue to believe that in Hughes, and indeed throughout the entirety of Hughes's oeuvre, Hughes has dared to produce profoundly hopeful work. Even as he clearly recognizes that all of our traditions, those of Picasso and the unnamed African both, may be broken, he relentlessly celebrates the fact that we, all, every one of us, continue to exist. Though our bodies and even our cultures may be diseased, we delight in the vulgarity of our living, though the slavers have never ceased to capture and defame us, to break our holds on both wisdom and comfort, to throw us from the bright light of the morning into the darkness of the hold. We obstinately continue, perhaps with trembling and regret, but also with undefeated stealth and uncanny confidence, into the delicious uncertainty of our dark adventures. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. That was marvelous.
Thank you.
We'd love to have some questions from the floor. I have several myself, but instead of me leading the way, Lubna here will be moving around the room with a mic. If you have a question, please offer it to Robert.
Can I ask why there's no air conditioning in here?
You have a question?
Why there's no air conditioning?
That's a good question. All right. Well, I wasn't suggesting that you had to
We can have a
ask Robert a question.
We can have a conversation, sir. Just go. Ask her.
Well, Picasso seems like a good place to start.
Yeah.
I instantly began to think about, the more I know about Picasso, the more it seems absolutely preposterous to the way that he's been assimilated into sort of a white European modernism. From Malaga, you can basically see North Africa. That's where he's from. If you look at the breadth of his career, from working with the Ballet Russe to the African Mass to La Demoiselle d'Avignon, which is itself his rendering of Delacroix, from an early realist period through all of his different periods, high, low, Pichones and Nice outside the window, along with his deconstruction of Velázquez. It works both ways, which is to say, suddenly by rethinking Hughes, one also has to rethink these others that are ostensibly there at the center. You did pick good examples with Eliot and Pound because they seem so sort of from central casting.
Right.
Gertrude Stein is a little bit more problematic, and I would argue Picasso is. And this is one of the wonderful things about by looking at this outsider, as it were,
we began to realize the extent to which some of the people who seemed like insiders were themselves far more complex characters.
One thing I'll say about that is I'll answer something that you didn't ask me, but that you sort of referenced about Alwaleed and Pound as being sort of from central casting. A very interesting thing about Hughes is that he and Pound had a relationship and communicated with each other for some years, and that Hughes was one of Pound's few visitors at, I think it's St. Anne's?
St.
Elizabeth's in Washington, D.C. And there are letters from Pound to Hughes in the Hughes papers at Yale. Hughes had a great respect for Pound, and Pound had a great respect for Hughes, though Pound was a horrible fascist and Hughes was not. But I think that one of the things that's going on is that the two of them recognized that in each other sort of kindred spirits in terms of the experiments that they were trying to do with their art. So that's just an aside. I find that sort of fascinating. I'll say to you that the Picasso thing, I've long been, I'm as sort of self-consciously, black and proud as I am. I'm the most Eurocentric person I know, and I'm a long lover of Picasso, and have spent a lot of time sort of immersing myself in his work just because I enjoy it. And I hadn't realized, however, the sort of things that you just said, actually pretty eloquently yourself about Picasso, until I actually was reading a biography of the Afro-American painter Romare Bearden, who was deeply, deeply influenced by Picasso, and lots of the modernist painters of the Harlem Renaissance were deeply influenced by Picasso. And Romare Bearden says that part of the reason that they so liked Picasso was that they didn't really think, they thought he was a sort of fake white person. And that they thought, that lots of his sort of ways of thinking about modern aesthetics were similar to the way that Afro-Americans think about modern aesthetics. And generally, I think it sort of has gone away. But one of the things that we don't talk about is that up until the 50s, Afro-American people were deeply interested in Spain and talked about it a lot. Afro-American intellectuals were very concerned about the Spanish Civil War, and of course fought in the Spanish-American War, traveled to Spain extensively, in some way, as extensively as one can imagine that it was possible, because they thought of Spaniards as being the white Europeans who were not one, or the white European, the Spaniard is the white European who was not one, and who sort of proved the lie of this idea of there's being a clear distinction between Africa and Europe. So Picasso, I think, in particular, is a person who is an individual who demonstrates that in his practice. Amazingly, once you allow yourself to sort of look at it, and I actually think even Velázquez, if you're talking about an earlier period, also has these black people that show up in his paintings, and all sorts of ways of thinking about light and dark that I find sort of fascinating, and I think that have to speak to the sort of Spain's being at the tail end of European culture in a way that's sort of structurally similar to the way in which Afro-American culture is vibrant in American culture, but is presumably at the tail end of it.
Thanks. We must have some other questions. We do. Joshua, here has a question. Thank you.
Thanks. I just have a couple questions that probably say more about me than anything else. But
all questions talk to you.
Yeah, everything does. But I was particularly interested in hearing more about how you're positioning the adolescent prostitutes.
Yeah.
And at one point, I almost thought you were saying, and I'm not, and maybe you were saying, I'm just not sure, that they were almost a kind of figure of resistance to something of some kind. But I don't think that's exactly what you're saying. And I've kind of grown increasingly uncomfortable with resistance as a kind of negative trope. And so there's something positive, some positive role that they were playing. I just wanted to get that, hear more about that.
Thank you. I can say about that in a way, I'm less interested in the prostitutes in themselves than sort of the consumption of their adolescence and the consumption of their virginity. So I will work that through. I'll take a look at it myself and think about what's interesting to me. What strikes me is that I am stunned that men aboard a slave ship are interested in not only having sex with prostitutes, which has some logic to it. That makes some sense to me, but I just couldn't figure out why it is that they're interested in girls and why it is that they're interested in having sex with presumed virgins. And so, actually, I'm more interested in a way in the men and in why it is that those men are interested in girls in particular. And I think that it's not just, the easy way to talk about that is to sort of just write them off as profligate or perverse or whatever. All of that's easy to do. But I also think that there's something about a way in which they represent a sort of unconquered land that I want to get at, and that they represent a certain type of ability to connect to something real and fixed and to the primitive that I want to get at. So that to me is more important than saying that the prostitutes in themselves, the girls are agents of resistance. I don't necessarily believe that. I think that we're to speak a little bit more directly to the spirit of your question, though, Josh. That one of the things that motivates this talk is that I am, as an Afro-American person, an African-American person, and an Afro-Americanist, I think that one of the things that ails us is the need to find sort of broad-shouldered heroes and people who have actually been easily ethical and easily are people who are easy to emulate, when the history of Afro-American culture has been one of lots and lots and lots of having to make concessions to capitalism and colonization as a matter of survival and thriving, and wondering whether or not you can produce a sort of theory around aesthetics and a theory around politics that's not based on just sort of going back and naming the good guys, but also going back and looking at the grand majority of us, the 99.9999999% of us, who have been something less than the good guys, and who are therefore still here to do whatever we do. That to me is the punchline, one of the big punchlines. One of the punchlines is basically the white people think they're white people, but they're just crazy. The second punchline is that I want to not be interested in the sort of light and all its goodness and light. I'm interested in those things that are in the dark, presumably, those things that are negative.
Yeah, that's because that kind of brings me to the second question in a nice way, which is has to do with the periodization of modernity in your talk.
Mm.
And I guess there I'm particularly interested in you saying more about what modernity really means here, particularly in the context of this narrative, because a lot of the elements of this narrative are not new,
right,
or aren't new in modernity. They're
right.
they're ancient. Empire is ancient. Slavery is ancient. Brutality, war, rape is ancient. Prostitution is ancient.
Yes, but
I know yes and no. I know I'm being crude, but so this is what I want. I want to know what then is the marker or the periodization of modernity in the context of these.
It's for me the conceit for me is to think about the world that we live in, that are existing in a society that is essentially continues to be slave society, and a slave society that is based on the African slave trade, and by the transatlantic African slave trade. So modernity is a sort of stand-in word for me, but I'm really only interested in those places in which you actually have European and Euro-American incursions into the African continent and the transportation of African captives to the so-called New World and to Europe. That is what really is interesting. That's what really compels me. Before that, I just don't know. But it's also a political thing to say that for me, a practice that doesn't take that into account, any practice, by the way, any cultural practice, that doesn't take into account the shock of slavery and the shock of colonization is a practice of which I'm critical. And that for me represents the sort of politics of where I come from. And that part of what I'm trying to do, part of all that long section about modernism at the end of it, by the way, and sort of the huffy part, that was sort of the huffy part, if you didn't notice, is to say those modernists, I hope there are no modernists. Oh, I'm insulting with this. I'm a modernist, I'll just claim it. Some of my best friends are modernists. That the inability of many persons to actually talk about those aesthetic procedures as having anything to do essentially with black people, or essentially with colonization, or essentially with the history of conquest is irritating to me. It irritates me. And I'm interested in Atlantic studies that begins with that moment of contact, that moment of brutal contact, where I think that this is distinct, by the way, from the fact that there has been prostitution is the oldest profession, presumably, and there has been slavery for as long as there have been human beings. Slavery and prostitution, as long as there have been human beings, is that the particular forms of racialization that come out of the transatlantic slave trade are ours. This is not something that we can say is part of the ancient world. This is something that is actually developed specifically. And by the way, that there's an incredible sort of self-consciousness about on the part of the slavers themselves. When they do that thing about I think that fascinating thing about the wall that separates the ship. I'm the only person who finds that fascinating, apparently. I've said this to multiple people, and their eyes always sort of glaze over about it. I just think that this is the sign of modernity, this barricade that's in the middle of the ship. But I think really that's how we continue to structure so much within our societies, our many societies. And what I'm trying to suggest is something like an opening in that wall, or that wall is always a sort of fake thing.
One of the things that this reminds me of is the idea that what's different about this modernity or this period is that there is this desire and this need to frantically define the separation, which is what you're talking about there. But I was just thinking about it in terms of égalité and fraternité and all of these other things. And one way of doing it during this period is nationalism. And the French, despite controlling large parts of Africa, see themselves as this country of these equality and democracy.
Right.
But the only way you can possibly maintain this is to have this boundary, which the stakes become incredibly high then, to create this boundary and defend it and define it. Nevertheless, the government in Paris is controlling huge parts of the world. That's its real realm,
right.
But it cannot acknowledge that, and it depends upon really co-opting a certain part of that realm, the part that we call France,
right.
and maintaining the separation.
Right.
I mean, I know Terry Eagleton has this way of putting it that the fracturing of modern art into cubes and all these other
right.
things is this sort of the separation from the reality of where your world is being produced,
right.
and not, and indeed the African elements that keep coming up in the art. This is his way of interpreting it rather than the bleeding of the boundaries, but that fits right into it as well.
Right.
It would be another way of saying it, that the boundaries, that people are trying to create these boundaries, but they're not real.
What I can say about that, Patrick, and that's very well said. You get that part of what is stuck in my craw is Fortress Europe is Fortress America, right? And that's what I'm trying to write against. That's also why I want to do something that uses my very clumsy language skills and says that it's okay to use those very clumsy language skills. That part of it you get. The other thing is that, interesting to sort of talk about you two guys together, I think that actually the prostitute thing I'm clear about, but I think that the sort of weirder thing that I say is when in that disease part, the D-I-S-E-A-S-E, and I say, oh, well, disease is not so bad because we're the diseased people in a way, and that the disease is this actual proliferation of diseases in some ways what we're about, and that's what that's where the promise of our humanity actually lies. That's a hard argument to maintain. It is a truly hard argument to maintain. So I don't know what I admit to not knowing. I know what the problem is. I know that nationalism does not work for anybody. What the answer beyond nationalism is, especially as the actual vehicles to move beyond nationalism are, as far as I can tell, pretty ugly vehicles themselves, I actually don't know the answer to that. So I don't know that I can say anything more sophisticated than that, except for to name it. The other thing I would say though is that it's easy to sort of talk about bad Europe, bad the United States, bad the United States as white United States as bad, but also part of what I don't sign off on is the sort of idea of Afro-American go back and get our lost roots either. That seems to me to be a part of a maintenance of a distinction between ourselves and the bad Europeans that has never been workable and that cannot be workable in the future. And so that part of the reason I know, and this I know, I feel it strongly when people say it to me, that if you say to a group, if you all were Afro-American people and I said to you, no, we're not going to do the go back and get it and prove that we were dignified and brave and proud and wonderful people, we're just going to connect ourselves to these regular white people who get on our nerves, is that the response to that is these regular white people who get on our nerves are so problematic, are so diseased, and what we're trying to do is produce something like a clean history of ourselves and a sort of place in history in a way to think about who we are that is no longer sullied and that is no longer in the pit. And I'm saying, no, we have to stay in the pit and do our work. And so that's, I think, the place that, in some ways, it's easy for me to be very critical of people who consider themselves white people, or to be very critical of people who consider themselves Europeans or whatever. But what's a more dangerous gambit for me is to actually be critical of the persons who think that we're not also deeply implicated in all of this together, or that the answers that we have to these. The answer is not intimately related to being implicated in that type of embrace of the slaver, the embrace of the colonizer, the embrace of the people who presumably are other people who carry the disease. So that's a difficult poem for me to read because I read it exactly incorrectly. Because I want it to be a more helpful poem than I think other people would think of it as. But I say straightforwardly that that's sort of the politics and the ethics and the metaphysics of this work, that I believe in that.
We have a question over here. Of course, one trick is not to declare borders. This is like one of the more recent tricks with nation states. You just don't have borders. Seren.
I'm interested in learning more about the idea of the new language, critically as well as in the primary text, and the discovery actually of this. What is it that makes this language new? Is it the way of feeling, or is it its essential characteristic as a way of spreading, for instance, enacting the different actions that it describes somehow.
Can I stop you there? Because I think that's the second one. Because I don't think that I'm interested in, I'm not interested in a language that is particularly self-conscious of itself. I'm more interested in ways of using language. That's a better way to say it, and thank you for that intervention, actually. Ways of communicating that allow us to value the ways in which we have difficulty dealing and understanding each other. I should say, by the way, this is what, that actually Beirut has done this to me, and it's you all's fault. Because any of you who, know, anyone of you who comes by my office at 12:30 knows that a sort of nice little lady comes and beats the hell out of me every day to try to teach me the horribly difficult language of Arabic, and I am not very good at it. And so it really is in my mind about how it is that you can actually be a person who is able to negotiate not something that is well structured, but that process of negotiating that thing that you don't know seems to me to be what we have to become more comfortable with and what we have to be better at doing. So I'm not even necessarily about the point of, being able to produce some new language. It's not like I want to create Esperanto. Instead, I want to value that process of being able to produce forms of communication that are not necessarily going to be fixed and that are not necessarily going to be permanent. I'm sorry to have cut you off.
Actually, this brings me to my second question, and it's about where is this new language? I know that it's not something which is neither fixed nor even produced yet.
Who invariably said, "What the hell is wrong with you?" That that we don't get what the point of what you're doing is, and that it really changed me, that experience. That the idea of that you can have a Creole languages that become new things is immediately to turn them into something other than Creole languages. And it's immediately to turn them into something that ultimately is about turning the old ladies who are saying, why are you here? Are you not going to pay me any money for, speaking this language that I know? Into resources and into you're taking the place of the colonizer that I don't want to do, that I just don't want to do. And it changed me. I don't have any more sophisticated thing than that to say, but I'm not a person who believes that traditional cultures have to be maintained. I'm not a person who believes that traditional languages have to be maintained, even when those are traditional cultures and languages that I feel close to and akin to, because I am afraid that the actual practice of that and the actual politics of that is to say, we need you people here to maintain your traditionality, your traditionalism, or whatever that word was, and your tradition. And we need you to stay in place. And so I don't fret about the dying off of cultures and languages in the way that other people do. I do fret about the inability of our being able to negotiate with each other, even when we know that we're not fully understanding what one's interlocutor is actually saying. And I think that we're very bad at it. We're shockingly bad at it. That this fear of, there's something that this person is trying to relate to me that I don't understand. This allows our being able to negotiate that which we do understand, and that which we can agree on and sort of move forward.
Do we have another question? Okay, let's take this question. It's a relationship between Pound and Hughes. Who would ever have thought it? But it's almost as if the two of you articulated it. I never would have imagined they could go together.
In the crazy house, by the way. And I've been having meetings in an insane asylum. And Pound is writing in black dialect to Hughes, by the way. So it's mind-blowing.
Yeah, this Pound-Hughes relationship is fascinating. I want to find out more about this.
You now know as much as I do, by the way.
I'll
find out more. But my question is a historical question. I think most historians would agree that it was slavery that led to racism rather than racism that led to slavery. And that, and also that slavery was, in the world historical perspective, overwhelmingly an integrationist force. So it maybe. I just wonder if you could clarify because at times your talk seemed to suggest the opposite to me, that segregation and racism were the defining features.
No, this is what I believe. I think you're right, Sam. Slavery creates the forms of racism with which slavery creates white supremacy. And I think that it's a very clever thing to say that slavery creates also a certain type of dispersal of human beings and a integration of human beings, various types of human beings. That does not preclude those societies from actually, because of that integration of human beings, actually producing these altogether false ideologies and structures of segregation. So that one of the things that you see is that the darker the United States becomes, in some ways you can, I won't do this right now, I'll just think out loud about it. But the thing I was going to say is that in some ways you could almost make the argument that the darker the United States becomes, and the United States is always sort of dark in a way, or the more cognizant of the fact that we live in this country that is not, or those of us who are Americans and citizens of the United States and who actually live in the United States, are not in a country that is the white man's country by any stretch of the imagination. The more the culture becomes cognizant of that and accepts that, the more you see even more rigid structures of articulation of culture to say, though we exist with all of these other people, we exist within this enclave within our society. So I think that the actual mixing itself, I don't think that it produces the segregation, but I think that one of the ways in which people have actually responded to the mixing of cultures is through segregationist practices.
We can have one more question, or we've almost worn you out. But I'd hate for you to leave without being completely worn out. So, no more. Well, again, tomorrow is Inside Job, the movie. I highly recommend it tomorrow at 5:30. And again, thank you, and thank you all for